my mother-in-law tried to replace me at my own wedding. She wore a white dress she had bought in secret. She hired a photographer to capture a moment she expected to be hers, and she arranged for the officiant to be available at the same hour if anything went wrong. She didn't whisper it as a joke. She planned it like a contingency, as if my presence was optional and hers inevitable. That is why I cancelled everything. It hurt because it wasn't theatrical or petty. It was a map of how much of my life she thought she could redraw. It was a claim on my name, my vows, the story I had chosen. And she did it with the quiet, steady assurance of someone who believed money and entitlement could substitute for love. We were engaged 11 months before the wedding date. Mark and I met at a small architectural firm. We were practical people who paid our bills on time and kept long lists. He was 34, careful with his words, generous with his hands. I am 30, a school counselor, the daughter of a nurse and an electrician. Our life together had been the usual accumulation of habits. A cat named Rumi, an old couch we both loved, a shared account for groceries. We planned a wedding that reflected us. Simple, a backyard rented from the property his mother owned, one Saturday in June. Nothing grand, no destination. We told family and a few friends. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, had been a current in the background from the beginning. She was a person who never quite went away. She'd raised Mark alone after his father left. That narrative had given her a place at the center of every family decision. She had clean hands and neat nails and a way of saying, "You'll understand when you're older," that always made Mark pause. If I pushed too hard, he'd look at her like she was part of his balance. She also had the money the way a tide has volume. She owned the property where we wanted to marry. She'd offered to cover the deposit for the venue, and she paid for the rehearsal dinner. When we thanked her, she said, "Family helps." I said yes because my family could not afford the deposit without us digging into student loans. I said yes because at that time the offer felt like what it was supposed to be, a generous hand, not a leash. I said yes because I did not see the clauses that were visible only to someone who read contracts the way a carpenter reads blueprints. We were not naive about control. I had grown up watching adults bargain and keep scores. But I believed that once we started the marriage, the practicalities would settle into normalcy. I did not expect the wedding itself to become the point where entitlement read itself into our vows. The first wave of exclusion was subtle. Evelyn insisted on attending planning meetings to be helpful. She began to book vendors I had chosen before I could say something. "Oh, I talked to Marisol about the flowers," she'd say, as though I hadn't already paid the florist a deposit. She changed the seating chart at the rehearsal dinner. She called guests and suggested people sit with family instead of us. Each small action felt like a sieve, choices leaking away until only the outline remained of what I had imagined. I tried to be reasonable. I kept my voice low in the middle of those conversations because the alternative was confrontation, which I feared would fracture the quiet trust Mark and I had. I told myself we could negotiate. I told myself that if I pressed hard, I would be the angry bride in a viral video. Bride told off mother-in-law. Better to be flexible, better to pick my battles. But the incidents accumulated. There was the day Evelyn asked our florist to make the bouquet traditional without asking me what that even meant to me. There was the text that arrived from our photographer. Evelyn would like to arrange the shots at the top of the ceremony, to include herself with Mark if you consent. There was Mark's hesitation, his voice softening when he said she just wants to be part of it. My reaction each time was to try to anchor the conversation in facts, the contract, the deposit, the plan we had shared. Facts didn't bend the emotional currency Evelyn used. Evelyn started to invoke narrative. She told our guests stories about Mark as a child in a way that painted her as the central caretaker and me as an addendum. At family dinners, she would tell me that wedding traditions in their family were important and that people expected a certain presence. She began to decorate the house with framed black and white photos of Mark growing up that she put on obvious angles when I visited, as if showing me the geography of influence. The second wave escalated into financial pressure. Months before the wedding, a vendor called to say the payment schedule had been altered. I logged into our shared planning portal and found invoices redirected to Evelyn's company account. She had given additional funds, she told me, and with them came suggestions. She would withdraw or adjust at a moment's notice. When I asked Mark about it, he said, "She's just trying to help." His tone made me wonder how much he feared that saying no to her would be saying yes to losing something else. The home, family history, the quiet approval he still sought. I kept trying to protect small things. We had agreed on the simple cream dress I wanted, no lace, no train, a shirt dress that felt like me. Evelyn sent a photo of a different dress to Mark with the caption, "This is what a bride should wear." I said nothing publicly. Privately, I asked Mark to confirm that our decisions would be respected. He said they would. That answer would be the prelude to a pattern where what he meant and what he did were separate movements. The manipulations became personal. Evelyn started to seed stories about my past, a scholarship, a job offer I had declined to stay close to Mark, and then framed them as signs of my opportunism. She called my sisters and asked pointed questions. She invited their opinions about whether I was ambitious enough for Mark. The tone of the conversations changed. Instead of being supportive, family gatherings became interrogation rooms for loyalty. I reacted the only way I knew how. I tried to document and to anchor. I kept copies of contracts. I saved text messages. I printed invoices. I started to write down times, who said what, where we had been. Keeping a paper trail felt like building a small ship I could climb into if the current got strong. The first really ugly break happened at the rehearsal. It was a week before the wedding. The rehearsal was small and Evelyn was early, insisting on arranging the chairs herself. The officiant, whom I had met 3 times, arrived and greeted Evelyn like an old friend. He followed her instructions more closely than ours. He set up a microphone where she could reach it easily. He told the bridesmaids to be in position for the entrance she had suggested. The photographer, under the excuse of being thorough, took shots when Evelyn stepped forward, framing her with Mark in the way our planned photos had for me. I remember the feeling of my chest moving too fast, like my breath and my thoughts were no longer synchronized. I asked Mark later that night, "Did you ask the officiant to do that?" He said no, and then he added quietly, "She was just trying to be helpful." At that moment, what hurt most was not the physical staging. It was having my reality rearranged by someone who treated me as a negotiable element in my own life. I called my mother. I cried on her kitchen counter and she said things that were both helpful and maddeningly simple. "You can walk away." She meant it in the practical sense, but walking away would have cost everything we had scheduled. The deposits, the savings set aside, the faces of people who had already purchased flights. I had never wanted the wedding to be about who could walk away with the least grief. There were quieter cruelties. Evelyn would arrive late to conversations and then stage small humiliations, paying for drinks loudly and then saying, "Oh, don't worry about him," as if reminding me of my economic standing. She would compare gifts I had given to Mark to things she had done, as if out-gifting were equivalent to out-being. She began to tell our mutual friends that I didn't understand family dynamics, which is a euphemism that feels like a shove. Each time I tried to draw a boundary, the consequence was the same pattern. Evelyn would press, I would react, Mark would be apologetic, and then something else would break. The wedding vendors would call asking to mediate, friends would text insisting we keep things calm, and I would respond by swallowing. I kept thinking, wrongly, that if I did not make it a public fight, it would remain negotiable. Then came the morning when negotiation was no longer possible. It was the day before the wedding. I had been awake since 5. A silence settled around the apartment that felt like a held breath. I checked emails the way one checks the weather before a long trip. There was one message with a subject line that read innocuously, "Updated timeline and special arrangements." It was from our wedding planner. I had read hundreds of emails from her. This one should have been another scheduling note. Instead, it contained an attachment, a PDF with a 2-column plan. On the left column, the timeline we had agreed on, processional at 4 o'clock, vows at 4:20, family photos at 5 o'clock. On the right column, a parallel plan titled Contingency Family Ceremony with a note that read, "In the event the principal bride does not wish to proceed, a family representative, Evelyn H., will hold a short commitment ceremony with Mark to preserve family harmony. Photographer and officiant have been instructed to accommodate." The document included cost lines, the signature of our planner. I read it 3 times. The planner had included language that made it sound like standard protocol, as if brides cancel all the time and someone had to stand in. The words themselves were not only permission, but an offer, a backup script. I called the planner. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was practiced, calm. "Oh God," I said. "Why is there a contingency with Evelyn's name on it?" She stammered an apology and then said, "We thought it might be, family." She tried to backpedal. I asked who had asked her to add that plan. She said quietly, "Mrs. H. She thought it would be better to have an option in case of emotional fallout. She wouldn't want the day to be wasted." Mrs. H. asked for it. The words felt like dropping a stone into still water and watching rings expand. "Did Mark know?" "I don't think so. We didn't speak to him directly about that line." I hung up. My hands were trembling in a new way, the kind of shake that comes from being forced to prove a thing that should be obvious. The contingency plan was a document that turned a private fantasy into an operational option. It was not only cruel, it was organized. I walked to Mark's office, feeling the length of the day compress into a single point. When I told him, he blinked and then said, "I thought she was joking." My voice surprised me when it came out, lower than I had planned, more steady because there was no time for performance. I asked him to read the attachment. He read it and his face changed in the way Faces change when they feel the bottom of something drop out. There was a silence. He put the laptop down and took my hand. "I'm sorry," he said. And then he said, "I should have seen it." The confession had the weight of an admission, not of malice, but of failure. I wanted to be kind to him. I wanted to say, it's okay, because we had an entire life beyond this document. But when I looked at him, I saw that the document had already done what documents do best. It reorganized loyalties. I sat down at the kitchen table and made a decision that felt enormous and necessary in the same instant. I called our planner back and said, "Cancel everything." She protested. "That will cost you thousands in forfeited deposits," she said. "I know." I did not want to make a dramatized announcement. I wanted practical steps. Tell me how to stop the contingency. Tell me how to void the timeline. She read a clause. The contract had a small print section about changes requested by primary payer. Evelyn had been listed as a co-payer in one form seemingly innocuous. She had added her name on a sponsorship line 2 months earlier. That line gave her a sliver of administrative authority. The planner said she could halt everything, but there would be penalties. I told her to stop the alternative schedule, to block the officiant's phone number for the time listed, and to refund what could be refunded. Then I called everyone. I called the venue, the florist, the photographer, the caterer. I told them I was cancelling the ceremony as scheduled and that I wanted the deposits returned where possible. Some vendors were sympathetic. Others explained cancellation fees and non-refundable deposits. Money began to be the arithmetic of my grief. Half the deposit, 3/4 non-refundable venue hold. I made lists and took notes. I did not want to make the cancellation a scene at the rehearsal or the ceremony. I wanted to take the drama out of something that had been weaponized into spectacle. I wanted to keep from giving Evelyn the stage she had already started to build. Cancelling also felt like a way of keeping the core of what the wedding symbolized, our decision to be together, safe from the person who was trying to rewrite it. If she could not have an official moment, she could not claim the story, but the cost was immediate and public. Evelyn called me, furious. Her voice said the worst thing she could find, that I was selfish, that I was ruining family expectations, that I was trying to humiliate her. She threatened to call everyone and tell them I had walked away. She said she would make sure no one in the community would ever work with me again. The language was small, the threats conventional, but the intent was clear, to make me feel that cancelling would be the social death she thought she could mete out. Yeah, Mark answered her call with a kind of separated politeness. He tried to mediate. Evelyn yelled, and then her voice became a wounded legalist. "I paid for the deposit. It is my right to make these arrangements." I heard in her voice the same tone she used when she rearranged chairs. A conviction that provision equaled ownership. I also heard the surprise, the underlying panic that her plan had been cut off. When I told my parents, my mother cried on the phone and said a string of small practical things I needed to do to protect myself. Confirm everything in writing, send certified letters if necessary, and most of all, take care of myself. My father was quietly furious. He said, "You did the right thing by not letting her steal your story." His use of the word steal felt appropriate, and still, it didn't erase the gnawing arithmetic that followed. The next day was viciously quiet. Friends started calling, some were bewildered, others relieved. My sister said, "You did what you had to. I felt like an amputee who had made a choice. There was relief in removing something that was killing me and a new pain in the missing part. Mark and I sat at our kitchen table for hours and mapped next steps, letters of cancellation, conversations with parents, attempts to recover deposits. We also tried to talk about the relationship, which felt like opening something that had been deliberately glued shut. The consequence I did not fully anticipate was the way cancellation widened into a test of who would stand where. Some friends took Evelyn's side in private messages, most said nothing. People posted half-understood speculation on social media. The community, small and wired by common acquaintances, enjoys allegiances. Cancellation became an act that forced people to choose. When I cancelled, Evelyn ramped up her own narrative. She called my work colleagues and told them that I had publicly shamed her. She posted on a private family group that we all need to be kind to mothers. She began to characterize the cancellation as an overreaction. The word unstable started to appear in messages she forwarded to mutual friends, framed as a factual observation rather than a weapon. It stung in a way that was both private and public. The low point came 2 weeks after I cancelled. We had lost money. Mark had retreated into a protective quiet that I couldn't penetrate. He slept in a guest room at his mother's house some nights. She had offered him space and he took it. I felt abandoned in a way that transcended any single action. The community began to shrink around us. Invitations stopped arriving for dinners. Phone calls went unanswered. The loss was not dramatic in the conventional sense. Nothing had exploded in a courtroom. It was the slow thing, my leverage gone, and with it, the sense that we could negotiate. I felt nakedly exposed. One evening, marked by a rainstorm and the kind of tiredness that makes you look smaller, I opened a file I had saved months earlier. A bundle of texts Mark and I had exchanged about our future plans, a list of goals, a note from him about buying a small row house. My hands found a trail in that folder back to a receipt I had never looked at, a wire transfer receipt from Evelyn to Mark that referenced family stabilization and a date 2 days after we announced our engagement. The wording was maddeningly bureaucratic. The transfer was not huge, but it was purposefully labeled. I felt something change in me when I saw it. I had been treated to a slow reveal of dependency, and I had not read the map. I took the receipt to our lawyer, a woman named Anna, who moved through the law like a person who arranges traffic lights. She looked at the transfer and said, "This isn't about the money as much as it is about leverage. She's been using money to set terms." She explained what I suspected. A small transfer like that can be the first in a series of financial moves that create obligations, especially when mixed with gifts of property, shared payments, or loans. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't dramatic, it was practical. Power often lives in ledgers. Anna suggested a path forward that was, mercifully, not theatrical. She said we could insist on a written agreement laying out boundaries, who paid for what approval each party had for the upcoming months. She also said that exposure of the wiring and the contingency document would make it harder for Evelyn to claim moral high ground in public. The plan hinged on a key document, the transaction receipts, the planner's contingency PDF, the email threads, assembling into an evidence of pattern rather than a single moment. The turning point arrived because of a mistake. Mark, in an attempt to patch things with his mother, forwarded an apology text that included the planner's contingency email. He meant it to be private between him and Evelyn, but he CC'd a group that included his sister, Laura. Laura, who had watched the tension accumulate and then watched our relationship fray, wasn't loyal to either side in the way an outsider might be. She was loyal to the idea of truth. She took the email, the receipt, and the text and sent them with a short note to our extended family distribution list. I am not proud of how vindicating that felt. The result was immediate. Messages flooded in. Some were angry, some were confused. The word manipulation began to appear in threads. Cousins who had been away stopped by. A neighbor I hadn't spoken to in a year left a casserole on my stoop and a note that said, "You deserve better than being made small." The planner, who had been all hospitality training and de-escalation scripts, suddenly had to answer in the light of the family's scrutiny. She called Evelyn and asked for an explanation. Evelyn, stripped of deniability, sounded less polished than she had in private calls. She muttered something about family traditions and then hung up. The exposure did not fix everything, but it rebalanced the scales. People who had been taking Evelyn's side quietly began to reconsider. Vendors who had been worried about offending the family suddenly found it easier to release deposits. A few refunds were issued. Not all of them. We still ate the cost of non-refundable invoices, but the financial landscape was less weighted. More importantly, the exposure changed Mark. In the light of other relatives and the receipts, he could not easily say, "I didn't know." He had to choose a role that reflected who he wanted to be. That change took weeks. It was not a single contrition. It was a series of small actions: returning a call, attending therapy with me once a week, saying no at a family dinner when Evelyn attempted to start the familiar narratives. He did not suddenly become brave. He became careful. That was enough. The payoff was slow and practical. Evelyn did not apologize in a way that repaired harm. She apologized in a way that saved face, a private message that asked if we would consider starting over. We did not reply. She went to her friends and told them we had been irrational. She stopped talking to some family members who sided with us. Social fractures happened. They were messy and real. For us, cancelling the wedding meant a lot of small consequences. We lost nearly half of what we'd paid. We took legal advice on how to structure finances so that gifts could not be used as leverage. We moved forward with new boundaries, our names on the lease, our joint accounts separate from family assistance, and a line of communication to say when help is help and when it is conditional. Some of that felt bureaucratic and prosaic, but it felt like building a dam against future floods. We also had to deal with the ruin of expectations. People love stories where brides walk away and rebuild in dramatic montages. Our version was quieter. We found a small chapel 3 months later and asked 3 friends and 2 cousins and a photographer who had been kind through all of this to attend. The ceremony was 6 sentences long. Mark and I did not post it online. We did not hold a reception. We did not invite people who had been cruel. That quietness was not the absence of triumph. It was an act of refusal. We refused to let someone else write the beginning. Evelyn and I never had an honest conversation that ended in reconciliation. We had a series of interactions that settled into a distant civility at family functions where we were both present. She remained at the center of her smaller group of allies. I continued to reframe my life in ways that involved fewer compromises. People who had been silent began to talk differently. Some apologized for not intervening sooner. those apologies mattered, in their own small way. They did not fix every lost deposit or the sting of betrayal, but they helped us reattach to a community that had been fraying. One of the things I did not expect was the way grief and relief walked together. For months, I felt like I had an open wound that would not scab. Weddings are cultural measures. When one's plans are undone at the hands of another, the sense of violation is almost physical. I found solace in small routines, long runs at dawn, coffee at the corner shop with a woman named Rosa who makes perfect espresso, therapy sessions that taught me how to say no without feeling like an arsonist. Saying no became a muscle. Building financial boundaries became a discipline. I started to recognize patterns of entitlement in other relationships and set a different tone. A year later, the costs of the cancellation are still present in spreadsheets and in conversations where names get left unsaid. The social ripple remains. Not everyone forgave or forgot. Evelyn has her stories, and I have mine. We continue to share the same family tree, but now with a measured distance. Life contains both inconvenience and choice. I wanted to be honest about both. When I reflect on that day now, I keep returning to the small things that mattered in the end. The document in the planner's email was the most concrete betrayal, a map of intent, and it gave me something legible to respond to. The mistake of forwarding that material publicly was the turning point that made it harder for people to pretend they did not see what was happening. Those two simple acts, a document and a mistake, were the pivot that shifted power back toward me. Neither was heroic. Both were effective. I did not get the wedding I planned. I lost money we could have used for a down payment. I lost the fantasy of the party and the faces we had imagined in the crowd. But I also reclaimed the parts of my life that had been quietly on the table. I learned that small documents and quiet evidence matter. I learned that leverage often looks like generosity until you look at the balance sheet. I learned to choose the life I wanted in small, enforceable steps. If you are listening and you are in the middle of something like this, where someone uses kindness as leverage and expects obedience in return, there is a way through that is less theatrical than revenge and more practical than resignation. It involves paper trails, boundaries, and sometimes the willingness to walk away from a single event to protect a larger life. That last part is not a platitude. It's a hard, complicated thing that costs money and relationships, but also preserves a sense of self. I'm not asking you to take my judgment as doctrine. I'm simply saying that the choice I made to cancel instead of being replaced was the only option that let me feel whole afterwards. It did not make the experience painless. It made the future possible. If you found this story meaningful, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. And if you've ever had to cancel something to protect yourself, I'd love to know how you decided. Leave a comment and tell me if you're comfortable.